For NiCHE Conversations. And yeah, today we are revisiting a piece from our first Succession Queering the Environment series, which was published in 2020. And we're going to be talking about food and classifications. And Paige is already here, so I'm going to invite her in. Go. Always a little back and forth, figuring out. There we go.
All right.
Hello, Paige.
Hello. For having me, Jessica.
Welcome to NiCHE Conversations. I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Paige Frazier. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. So I just completed a doctorate in American Studies at Purdue University. And my studies were primarily in food studies, but also queer studies and how those intersect. And more specifically, my project dealt with vegan food cultures, how they may be niche or underappreciated or not misunderstood maybe, how queer people have been invested in eating, creating, promoting veganism and vegan food now and throughout history.
Cool. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Because as I was talking about earlier, I invited you here today to talk about a piece you wrote for us in 2020 for our first Succession Queering the Environment series. And this was a piece called Drag Cuisines, the Inherent Queerness of Vegan Food Ontologies. And the pieces that we ran in this series have had a lot of they've been very popular continuously since then, and people are often clicking and reading your article, which was what brought it back into my attention. And I thought I'd invite you on to talk about it, because why not, you know?
Sure.
Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to start off with was to talk about the term ontology, which I think can be a bit intimidating for like the general reader or even myself. So how would you define ontology or ontologies to someone who's unfamiliar?
Sure. So ontology is one of those kind of annoying academic words that has very specific applications. And I think for my project, it has lots of connotations that I think are relevant. So when I think about ontology, and I think the way that I talked about it in that short piece that I published in NiCHE, I kind of talked about it as a thing or a person or an idea's nature of being. So the nature of something's being, its essence, maybe you could say.
Yeah.
But I also like to think of ontology as kind of like, I had a professor one time describe it as of the beginning. So it's like a thing's genesis, how it came about, its properties, what make a thing, like that particular, how we define that. So you can see how that's like closely tied to classification and categorization, because in order to classify something, whether that's food or people or cultures or whatever, in order to classify it, we first have to understand its basic properties, its basic ontology, like how it got to be what it is and how its nature. Its innate qualities or inherent qualities.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So you've touched upon it, that ontology is connected to classification, and this piece is about food. So how do we tend to classify food? And, you know, specifically, how do we classify meat and vegan foods?
Sure. So there are myriad ways that we classify food, as you know, right? I mean, you can classify it by how you cook it, whether it's baked or fried or steamed. You can classify it by, you can create a value system and say this is healthy food or this is junk food. This is 5-star gourmet, or this is you know, hole in the wall. You know, like you can kind of classify food in those ways. Or you can classify it by what it is, so how it came about. And that's, again, kind of getting back to my project, about meat being classified traditionally as something that is of an animal. So typically that means animal flesh, but then there are also meats that come from an animal that aren't exactly flesh. You know, I'm thinking of like really highly processed meats. And then vegan food, I think, like, you can go back to meat coming from an animal. We can say a grain comes from a particular type of plant. Vegetables come from a particular type of plant. Fruits are given to us by plants, like they come out of plant. So there are different ways we classify plant-based foods. But then vegan cuisine, when it's acting as meat, kind of throws a wrench in that ontological project of classification. Is arguing. So how do we understand where vegan food comes from? What do we call it? Who's eating it? Who's promoting it? Can you call a tofu burger meat? Can you call the Impossible Burger meat or plant-based meat? Do you have to qualify it? You know, these are like just debates that we're having in our culture, and we've been having for a long time. But yeah, that's kind of partly what interests me about this question is, how do we struggle to understand the ontology of food, and how is ontology fundamentally queer? And I argue that it is. That's my argument, is that it's fundamentally queer.
Yeah, I love this idea of thinking of
Questions are
classification.
overcomplicating it.
Yeah. So I love this idea of thinking about the classifications of food, because once you start thinking about it, then you're like, whoa, we classify like on the daily without thinking about it, and it's really fascinating to think about it. And I think the good and bad foods, the whole foods, the organic foods, the junk foods, the local foods, you know, we're always just constantly thinking and you know, and identifying ourselves with some of these foods, right? Like some of these foods become, and these classifications become a lifestyle. And I think veganism can be one of those. And, you know, I'm not vegan, but I love vegan food and I prefer vegan burgers. Like by far, I think they make me feel less disgusting after eating them. I think they taste better. But this idea of, you know, do I like it because it resembles the meat that I was, you know, grew up with? And, you know, also, is that like a gateway from like diehard meat eaters, like considering vegan food, right? Anyways, it's very fascinating. So, and as you hinted at, you think of all of this as being queer. So how do you apply the term queer in this article and in your work more broadly, I guess? And, you know, why do you think vegan food is queer?
Sure. So what I wrote about for NiCHE was how vegan food, as we try to classify it or categorize it, it blurs the lines of what we consider to be appropriate classification. I can't count how many times I've seen like a post about something vegan on Instagram or Facebook or something, and there are like angry people in the comments saying, I don't care what you vegans eat, but don't call it meat or don't call it cheese. You know what I mean? Like there's this idea that if it isn't ontologically the same as what we consider to be traditionally bacon or burger or cheese, that it then doesn't meet the requirements of that, therefore cannot be called that. So this naming process is very political, and it is a battle for legitimacy. That's so this I think fundamentally vegan food struggles. And that's how I see it as queer. We struggle to categorize it in a way that pleases anyone or much less everyone. But we also struggle vegan food itself struggles. It struggles to be taken seriously on the plate,
Mm-hmm.
to be seen as legitimate. People refer to vegan food as analog or fake or faux. You know, different ways that vegan food must qualify itself in order to be allowed to be present. You know what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes by its very presence, vegan food challenges or subverts the hegemonic status quo of American food. So that's the other, so it's kind of threefold. So it troubles the project of food classification, that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
So it troubles that order, that established order of classification and categorization.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, it struggles with its authenticity and legitimacy. And number three, it challenges or resists the flow of what I call American food nationalism. So when I say American food nationalism, how is food tied to our American identity or our Western identity? Not because it's not just, but how is it tied to those identities, and how is it also linked to our national imperial project? Mm-hmm. So how is food linked to American empire? I argue that vegan food challenges that to a degree. Does that make sense?
It's such a gorgeous example of how food just is this nexus of all these such rich and important and political and contentious and topics, gender and environment and climate and animal, like more than human relationships, all these things come together. Mm-hmm. And it's also a really good example of the way in which we can use queer beyond sexuality, beyond human identity, right? And I think sometimes I see people who aren't versed in queer theory or queer studies kind of being confused or even sometimes angry when queer is used to describe something beyond the human, like romantic or sexual relationships, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really interesting and perhaps a way to show how that can be used to mean something that's just challenging the main status quo, right? Something that, a rebellion of sorts.
And part of my project that I didn't publish in NiCHE, but a different chapter, because this was part of a longer dissertation. But part of, my third chapter, I talked to queer vegans and kind of get their take on, are these concepts linked in any way? How did you become, some questions that I would ask were, how did you become vegan? How did you realize you were part of the LGBTQ community? How do you identify, and are these journeys or processes of becoming similar in any way or linked in any way? Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just tossing around the word queer and saying, this is queer, that's queer, and just because I say so, you know what I mean? But people from the community to say, well, actually, there is a lot of similarity between growing up a queer person and having to feel like you have to always legitimize yourself or struggle to be your authentic self. Mm-hmm. And then kind of coming into vegan eating and having that same experience in this completely other realm of your identity in your life. Yeah. What I found was that in talking to people, many of them said that because I'm queer, it made it easier. I was already primed for that kind of struggle. Yeah. Which is why we see so many queer people who are vegan or vegetarian or who in other ways subscribe to alternative eating as well. So that's another piece that isn't part of the stuff that I published in NiCHE, but is really pertinent. I think kind of helps round out what I'm trying to argue, that it's not purely theoretical, but it actually comes down to people's oral histories, experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's really brilliant. I love that. And I'm just thinking, like the experience of, going to a large general gathering and not knowing, if you can be yourself, or not knowing if you will have food that you can eat. You know, like that's like a very similar experience that I'm just rolling through in my mind.
There's an anxiety that comes with that, right?
Yeah.
And there's an emotional experience, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think when you find those kind of when you find those like people, or when you find that eating community, or whatever it is, you know, whichever way we want to talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
that can be cathartic. You know, it's like identities kind of coming together in these really niche ways.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm arguing is that the queer vegan culture is out there and it's happening and it's being made, but we're not really pausing to look at who are vegans. I'm not saying queer or that every queer person is vegan,
Yeah.
but who are vegans and how are queer people eating? I think those are both important questions, and what I've found is that there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's cool stuff. I like it.
Thank you.
And your dissertation is available now, right? For people to check out?
It is. It's on the Purdue repository right now.
Cool.
But I'm also in the process of peer review. So we will see where I'm hoping that we can get this thing published in the next year or two. So
Awesome. Well, you know, send me a message when that happens.
Absolutely.
And I'll spread the word. We can even maybe do like a new book post on NiCHE if we want. So that'd be cool.
I mean, I also publish follow-ups to, other pieces that kind of expand on that first post.
Yeah.
NiCHE. So
cool. We will be having Succession 3. So the third version of Succession this June. I've just, we've kind of rolled into an every other year type deal. So we did 2020 and 2022. So 2024, look for the call for papers in January, Paige and others who are watching. So, yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today. This was a pleasure, and I absolutely love your research. And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was really enjoyable. I'm happy to do it again sometime.
Cool. Okay, take care.
All right, you too. Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks.